is quite an honor for me to be back at the 10th anniversary. If you think about that, that's quite an accomplishment that BI has been able to bring to this part of the world. And it's taken many people a lot of time and probably a lot of money to be able to do this. I'd like to go back in time just a little bit and kind of reminisce. We've heard a lot about PRRS in the laboratory. We've heard a lot about application. Dr. Erlingson did an excellent job of telling us about the difference between ELISA and PCR. But the 5-step program that we're going to discuss today didn't occur all at one time. It occurred over time. Back when I first started, a client asked me to eliminate PRRS out of a multiplier herd. It was in 1997. We were successful by the year 2000. We did not have PCR tests at that time, so we had to be creative in using naive pigs called sentinels. So what I'm trying to say is the process of controlling PRRS has also evolved. Some of the techniques are still changing today, but a lot of the basics are the same. Today we can put terms with them, we understand them better, and we know what to do. So with that, let's go beyond PRRS. What is so common throughout the world is it's not just PRRS, but PRRS is our primary. So if we can look at this, so we know that PRRS is present, we know that PCV2 is present, it's endemic in a lot of flows, mycoplasma is there as well. So how do we approach 3 very costly diseases? So PRRS is present. What does it mean? We have to watch the clinical signs, but sometimes they don't tell us the full picture either. And I'll show you some of that later. What's the infectious chain? Here's a term we didn't used to use, but we are today. We're going to go into that. So I got cough in pigs. Well, it must be mycoplasma. And I'll show you that it's not always that as well. So this combination of influenza, other co-infections, that's what's evolving. That's what's changing, and that's how we still have to apply what we know, use evidence-based medicine in our approach to understand if we need to change or not. So to drive home the point that PRRS is still number 1, back when IPVS in 2014 was in Mexico, prior to that, John Harding was selected to be our keynote speaker. Well, he interviewed 300 of us veterinarians from around the world through a survey, wanting us to list the most costly disease. And as you can see, PRRS virus is number 1. PED at that time was kicking our rear ends in North America, and so we were listing it as our number 2 most costly disease. So I asked our friends at Iowa State to give me a breakdown by percent of cases submitted by we practitioners as to what was still being important in North America. And as you can see, PRRS is still number 1. This virus, this influenza type A virus, swine, is number 2, and it has been the most frustrating pathogen that I've dealt with in the last 2 years. It continues to change, it continues to show itself. There's not a seasonality to it anymore. We can have multiple strains in a farm at the same time. So it's evolving. I think we in North America tend to forget about Pasteurella. We don't talk about it very often. Number 3 is mycoplasma. So what's happening with PRRS? You've heard Dr. Mike Murtaugh talk about 174. Well, if you look at this chart on the left, the orange is the 174. So again, on the number of cases submitted by practitioners, we had it in 2010, 11, 12, 13, but it wasn't until 2014 that we were submitting cases with more of it. So in our industry, this particular isolate has proliferated and has become the most common one that we're identifying. On the other hand, this is type 1, this is the EU strain, and it has continued to diminish. It's still present, but we're not finding it as often. Is that because one virus is more dominant over another virus? I have no idea, but we'll have to wait and see. The chart on the other side of the slide illustrates circovirus. And the point that I'd like to drive home here is that 20% of our cases that we submit continues to be positive for circovirus. So even though you vaccinate your pigs, circovirus can still be there. So the vaccine's doing what it's supposed to do in controlling the clinical signs once the pigs get infected. So the summary point is PRRS continues to change. There's your variation that we've heard about today already. Co-infections are present. So the epidemiology, I've used this slide many times over the last few years, but the epidemiology of PRRS, this complex that we're talking about, this list can change depending on where you're at in the world and what you want to add to it, but this is the primary pathogens. The secondary pathogens are oftentimes what kills the pigs, causes us to have the most economic damage because the pig is still trying to fight off the primary. You see this, or we see this, as a non-productive cough, and we think mycoplasma. Well, in most cases, it's not just mycoplasma. Another reason I like this slide is to show that all the pigs are not the same color. In other words, we've got an immune status difference in the population that you just weaned into that nursery. And our goal would be to try to make all the pigs of the same immune status. Of course, owners of pig farms realize what disease costs them. Reduced growth, mortality, and things like that. So back to our clinical expression of disease. Very, very important for us to understand. And sometimes we have to go out and see the pigs to fully get an appreciation for what they're being challenged with. But the take-home point is we got to be careful in thinking cause and effect. So a clinical sign may or may not always mean that particular disease. And for instance, I'd like to point out this very last cause, management. We have a 4,200 sow farm that was having routine abortions. The incident rate would vary from week to week, but it was fairly consistent. Now this farm is PRRS naive, mycoplasma naive. No other clinical signs was going on, just abortions. In doing my investigative work and watching the people give the vaccination, they were so intense in their process that they were causing the sows to abort. There was no parity distribution. It was just all parities were involved, and it varied from week to week because they didn't always vaccinate sows every week. Infectious chain. What is an infectious chain? We talk about pathogens a lot, but pathogens follow the pigs. So what we've wanted to build today, I think very clearly in your mind, is that this sow herd needs to be field virus PRRS negative. If it's got field virus in it, you're going to inherit problems in the nursery, and those pigs are going to go into the finisher and not perform very well as well. You're going to see that in my case study. So, infectious chain, you've got a diminishing immune level and an exposure level that is increasing. Dr. Erlandson mentioned this fact that you might have one pig that you weaned, and then you didn't see the PCR positives until, I think in his case, 11 weeks. That's what's happening. As exposure increases, your immunity is going down with the different pathogens. And it doesn't matter to me if this is a single site, 2-site, or 3-site. The only difference as a veterinarian is I approach 2 sites a little differently. I can control disease. I can maybe eliminate disease a little easier. But we can do the same thing on single sites. Who in this room sees a lady's face? I've used this before, so some of you have seen it. Who, on the other hand, might see an Eskimo entering a cave? Who might see both? Anybody? There's some. Some of you are awake. Very good. The point that I'm trying to drive home here is that you and I might see this population of pigs a little differently. And we evaluate the clinical expression a little differently. Doesn't mean either of us are right or either of us are wrong. We both need to use our expertise, what you fall back on, past experiences, reaching out to colleagues, looking at the literature, what the researchers are telling us, what's coming out of the lab, and build that case presentation. This is called evidence-based medicine. You do it instinctively. Now you have a term that you can apply to this. I'd like to go into this fictional detective, this Sherlock Holmes series. I read these books as a kid. I happened to pick one up the other day and was reading through it again, and it struck me that Sherlock Holmes wanted data. And you know, I ask for data all the time. Records are very important. So the other thing that struck me with this, reading through this one book, was the fact that Sherlock didn't always go from cause to effect. Sometimes he went from effect to cause. He went backwards in his thinking of what was going on and how he was going to diagnose the case. We've done that with PRRS. We're doing it with other pathogens as well. So evidence-based medicine, Sherlock Holmes' approach has been around for a long time, as you can see in this reference. But the point is, that's how we change. That's how we move from where we were 10 years ago to where we're at today. We continue to ask very, very good questions. The other point I'd like to leave with you before we get into the meat of this presentation, PRRS is like a river. Sometimes that river is very serene and very calm. You like to go fishing or swimming or whatever. Other times, it's raging. It's causing lots of damage. Well, that's like PRRS. How do we get back to crossing that river when it's raging? Well, that takes a team. That takes everybody on the farm staff to do the right thing at the right time. Don't want to get into the cost of PRRS too much, but I want to illustrate in this slide how I tend to think of things a little differently as a practitioner. So, I've already mentioned, and I agree with Professor Jan, that we ought to eliminate field virus PRRS from your sow farm. Doesn't mean that we stop vaccinating. Something very unique with this modified live vaccine is if that animal has seen it before and continues to only see the modified live vaccine, they won't shed, or they only shed a very small part of the time. One study shows 0.5% to 1% of the time you might pick up some vaccine virus. So that's telling us we can use this thing as a tool even if we eliminate the virus and as we move forward. On the other side, I have clients, and there's a lot of people in this part of the world, we're after control. We want to control the cost of this infection, of this disease. Why is PRRS so unpredictable? We've talked about the variation. Dr. Murtaugh did an excellent job of showing us that the virus itself varies, and the animals within a population vary. But let's throw a few more figures onto this thing. The human interaction, how the people take care of the pigs, the environment. Is it hot? Is it cold? Are we keeping the pigs comfortable? Co-infections, again, population dynamics, how's the animal flow, this infectious chain, all this comes into play nutritionally. Mycotoxins reduce the immune system's ability to perform. All of this comes into play as what you see and how you build your evidence-based approach. So let's do a little review, because we haven't really looked at vaccine yet and seen what's the pros and cons of using the vaccines. Vaccines can prevent infections? Not at all. But what the term that you heard and what we've learned over the past 10, 20 years is that if we vaccinate that animal, if that animal's free of field virus PRRS, we vaccinate it, then it gets exposed, it has a better chance of handling that exposure, no matter if it's high-path PRRS in this part of the world or 174 or whatever in another part of the world. Vaccines can correct management. Not at all. If we don't vaccinate at the right time, for instance, we need 3 to 4 weeks between vaccine and field virus exposure to have the best results, or longer to have the best results. We've learned that the hard way over the years as well. And then biosecurity. As you get into cleaning up these farms, internal biosecurity is extremely important. This summer, I was in the final stages of a 174 cleanup, 1200 South Farm, and we continued to find PCR positives on our baby pigs. When we tested newborns, they were all negative. We tested pigs at weaning, we had some positives. It was so simple that we had overlooked the fact that they were running the pigs out of the farrowing house down the hallway to the loadout. They were not cleaning and disinfecting the hallway fast enough. We were walking, the farm staff was walking the virus right back into the early farrowing rooms. And that's where the exposure was coming from. As soon as we corrected that, we lifted the status on that farm. It was stable. This is a take-home slide because it illustrates what several of the speakers have already talked about. This is a naive pig, never seen virus, never seen vaccine. This is the day 0 is when he gets infected. This is J.P. Kano's work out of the University of Minnesota a few years ago. And again, we get an antibody response, ELISA response in roughly 7 to 14 days. We can find virus in some piglets out to 35 days. So that's that viremia. And boy, when there's virus in that little pig's blood, he is shedding a pretty good amount of it. The other take home is shedding. What we're really talking about is transmission of a pathogen. And how do you get ahead of transmission if you can't control shedding? So what do we do with this? And then to drive another point home, it's during this period of time that the immune system is starting to work and remove the virus out of the body of that animal. So today, versus several years ago, we close these farms for a longer period of time. In other words, we try to get 7 months worth of gilts located either in the sow herd or someplace similar so we can put their immune status the same as the sow herd. Now, what does vaccine do to us? We call it previous exposure. So here's a pig that we vaccinated before it got infected. Got infected on day 0. We get a faster response on the ELISA. We shorten the viremia. We shorten shedding. Now we've got a little bit of control. Now you can start to get ahead of this PRRS virus and understand it. There's still a lot in this time period that we don't understand, as we've heard earlier. So we're still closing these sow herds for 7 months. Originally, I closed them for 8 weeks, 60 days. We were successful, but the virus has changed. The sites have changed. We got bigger sites today. We got more dynamic going on in these units. This is an example. You've seen already a slide similar to this, but this is BI's work over the last several years where they take every new type of virus that we have, field virus, and they test it the same way. So this is in research settings. You can see we have 21 on this chart. This was published a few years ago. Today we're going to add a couple of more that I should have had. They were at layman. But in all cases, we significantly improve the body's ability to handle a PRRS infection if we vaccinate them before they get infected, so previous exposure. Secondly, look at the variation that you see here. Unvaccinated pigs, 62% lung lesion. A vaccinated pig's only 8. But you can take another example on that chart, and you can see nearly 30%, it'd be trial 14, 30% vaccinated lung lesions, 36% in the unvaccinated. So these viruses vary a lot in how they affect the pig and this is all averages. So there's individual pigs in there that were pretty bad and others pretty good. Build a strong offense in your vaccine herd comes back to these 5 steps. This is another take home. Evaluate your goal as number 1. Do you want to control? Do you want to eliminate? What's your neighbor's situation? What's going on around you? What kind of external biosecurity do you have and internal biosecurity? We're going to deal predominantly with step 4 because I think that's where the application is so important. But before I get into that, let's look at a study that I participated in with Dr. Mike Murtaugh and his team on circovirus. There were 6 farms in this study, and we had one farm that was vaccinated because we had weak pigs at birth. Now, the pre-weaning mortality on this sow farm didn't increase. There was no PRRS, no mycoplasma in this particular sow farm. It was a 2-site system. And so when we saw these weak pigs, we thought, oh my gosh, we got infected with PRRS. We did our diagnostics, found that there wasn't any. The only thing we found was circovirus in pigs at birth. We could keep these pigs alive, but the farm staff had to work very hard at it. So we vaccinated that sow farm. So when Mike asked for his study, he wanted a vaccinated sow farm. It's number 3 was ours. And you can see with these whisker type charts that we found virus everywhere. Sows would farrow and they would have virus in their system, even in the vaccinated farm. So again, the point that I'm trying to make is some of these viruses are endemic. They're very common throughout our farms. They vary. If you see a clinical problem, use your tool. And in this case, it was vaccine. So as you can see, there was no effect on parity. Virus was in the colostrum, oral fluids. Sows were viremic at birth or at farrowing. We found virus in the farrowing crate. So it was everywhere. So what I learned out of this that changed my paradigm with circovirus is that I could use vaccine in sow herds successfully. I understood better what was going on with the circovirus and why there's sometimes we have PCVAD in the nursery or the early grower. So let's get into this tool called 3-Flex. And let's first look at the fact, can we vaccinate all 3 antigens at the same time, or should we tease them apart? This particular trial used Mycoflex, Circoflex as one injection, MLV as the second injection, given at the same time. The other pigs were given 3-Flex in one injection. And so we'll look at different things. We knew that the sow site was positive for PCV2, mycoplasma, and PRRS. We looked at mortality, and we looked at calls. And as you can see, this would be where the vaccines were teased out. This is where 3-Flex was used. No significant difference. Looking at weight gain from 0 on out to 133 days. Average daily gain and so forth. Looking at mortality and calls, the very similar findings. Nothing statistically significant between these 2 approaches. So this gives us confidence that we can vaccinate all 3 antigens at the same time. There is one caveat that I'd like to mention. If I have a PRRS seroconversion 2 to 3 weeks in the nursery, so 2 to 3 weeks after I fill that nursery room, I got field virus circulating, I will pull these 2 vaccines apart, do like we have here on this side, but I'll use my PRRS vaccine at a younger age in those piglets until I can flush that out of the nursery and not have seroconversion going on at that young age. Then I move right back to my 3-flex again. So there's the application of how I use this tool. The benefits of using a combination product, I don't have to mention to most in this room, but it's less stress on the pig, it's less stress on the people, it's reduced labor, and we really try to focus to get a good injection done. That's what I try with my training, is to impress upon the people given that injection, let's make a good time if we're only going to do it one time. So proper mixing of the products and everything. Now let's look at mycoplasma. I like this slide a lot because it gives me a mind picture of what's going on. These little cilia are all the way from our bronchi all the way down into the smaller tubes in the lung. And that brings the dead cells, it brings all the dust and dirt and everything out to the outside. The organism is right here. You can see this is the cilia, here's the mycoplasma organism, and then we have our antibodies attaching to that. And what that does is it doesn't allow the cilia to bring all that stuff to the outside. So it's a little bit like the escalator that all of us are familiar with, takes us to the top. Well, when the escalator's broke, we have to climb the stairs. And that's very, very difficult in a pig's lungs if we damage that escalator. Back to co-infections. This is Tanya Opresnik's work when she was at Iowa State University. The one slide, or the one lung here, shows 21 days after infection, circovirus only. This shows mycoplasma only, 21 days. So we have a little bit of lung lesions going on. But the two pathogens together really, really compromise that lung. And that's what you're dealing with when we say as veterinarians you've got pneumonia. This is a little hard for you to see, but it's looking at sow vaccine for mycoplasma and pig vaccine. So the first line is where we use no vaccine. The second, N and then a V, is where we vaccinated the pigs. Here's where the third line is where we vaccinated sows and not pigs, and the last line is where we vaccinated both sows and pigs. So you're going to ask, why do I vaccinate some of my sow farms? Because here there's not a lot of difference between the two key types, between lung scores and histopath. I can tell you as a veterinarian, I don't fully understand it, but I believe we're reducing the amount of shed transmission from sow to offspring. So the fewer mycoplasma organisms in that offspring, the less clinical expression I see out in grow finish. That's why it's called evidence-based medicine, and in some cases I vaccinate that sow farm as well as the pigs. And that's the conclusion here with this slide. So how do we diagnose PRDC? We've talked about the clinical signs, your records, how well the pigs are eating or not eating and growing, and then our diagnostic test. And in some cases, I'm using the oral fluid sampling as often as I'm bleeding pigs. Because what I'm most interested in is what those pigs are being exposed to, what those pigs are shedding. If they're shedding influenza virus, PRRS virus, mycoplasma, which is more difficult to find on oral fluids, then I have a better feel for what I can do in those pigs. So your diagnostic labs over here, we really need to get so that we're confident in our oral fluids. Well, let's get into this case study. It's 2200 sow farm. And I want to show you what happens over time when they're challenged with lots and lots of different strains of PRRS, influenza, endemically infected with mycoplasma. First thing I do when I go onto a farm the first time especially is I look at the site characteristics. As you can see, we shower in here, and you might wonder why we shower in. When he has his own feed mill, so we have lots of feed trucks coming in and out all day long. We have the walking pattern is right through farrowing into finishing, and then from finishing right back through farrowing. But this man has been extremely successful over the last 30 years, and he's continued to add and add and add without the concept of transmission. infectious chain, okay? This is where it doesn't stop here, but this is the first step. The second is he added, a few years ago, prices of pigs were very good, so he added a few finishers and nursery, and he bought this property over here so he could have an isolation barn for his purchased gilts. But there was another building there, and he wanted to use it, so he made it his truck wash. So trucks come back from market, get washed, we infect the replacement gilts. And it doesn't stop there. Let's look at the area surrounding this man's farms. At the top is the sow herd. He built a site here that has 12,000 head of pigs. It's a wean to finish site. So we bring weaned pigs down, hold them until they go to finishing, go to market. Think about his flow. The way he fills this 12,000 head site, we only have 5 or 6 weeks that he's not having some young pigs come into this site. That infectious illustration again, older pigs exposing young pigs. Then we have today, I need to update this slide, today we have 60,000 pig spaces within a few miles. Tremendous exposure through the air. And so we drag these things back to his sow farm. Now, this is what happens in real life. It happens here. We'll look at June at the 12,000 head wean to finish site. We had influenza and H3. There's one type of PRRS, a 142, Euro strain PRRS, mycoplasma in July. At the south site, we had a 184. We're getting multiple types of PRRS in his flow over time. In addition to that, we also had this 118.4 at the 12,000 site, and then in December, we had a different type of flu. And guys, this is common. This is common all over the world. So how do you approach this with any kind of confidence? Well, we build that confidence in our health program by looking at the records, the closeout records. So as we empty that nursery or we empty that wean to finish barn, we're evaluating average daily gain and feed conversion and so forth. This is our farm goals. We were doing very, very well, even in the finisher portions of this flow, until we had the field virus get into the sow herds. Now, we controlled the clinical outbreaks in the sow herd, but as I said earlier, we inherit weeks of infected pigs that you wean, that live through the challenge. They go right into the nursery. They don't do very well. We move them into the finisher, and again, they don't do very well. But I'll put these records up against anybody to show that it can, if we do the right things at the right time, without changing the flow, we can still get pretty decent performance. This slide's extremely important, again, in trying to understand the tools, the diagnostic tools that we have versus health. We tested this site, this flow, October, January, April. We tested isolation, late gestation, 14, 16, and 22 weeks of age in the finisher. These are ELISA titers to mycoplasma. So our first results show us we had at 14 weeks, we had conversion, we had exposure, so we had very good, well, 100% of the samples were positive at 16 weeks. Now, a few months later, it's moved to later pigs, and then the next sampling, there was no exposure. This is part of the confusion, again, with PRRS, why we tend to have it at some times and not have it at other times. It's another reason that we do proper diagnostics and interpretation. I like to monitor abortions in sow farms that are endemically exposed to field virus PRRS. It's a very good test of knowing what's going on. The red line is our threshold that we've developed in our part of the world. In the fall, we have a little tick up in the number of aborts. The blue line is what he was achieving until the summer of 2013. We had a drought in 2012, which really stressed the corn. He ran out of his own raised corn in the summer and had to start buying from his neighbors. So the first spike is from moldy corn. And so you had 1 week where we fed it. And then we got it out and we changed corn source. So today the task is managing the health challenges, training of the individuals, because the owner of sow units, what they really are asking us to do is to provide a constant number of pigs that go to market. That's our goal. So the bottlenecks that occur, the constraints that occur between weaning and market, we have to manage. And 3-Flex over time has greatly reduced, has really improved that aspect for us. And again, load, close, homogenize, or expose, you can use those words interchangeably. That has evolved over time. What is constantly changing in that is how we close some of these sites. Each site is kind of unique in what you do, what age of gilt you bring in, things like that. So that's the aspect that's changing for us in the application. So take-home messages are, you want your sow herd free of field virus PRRS, and we can do that. We can consistently do it. We do it in America as well. You want to improve those reproductive production levels, and you do that through health, and you have to monitor those nursery finisher pigs. So, PRDC, news is we have better tools today than we've ever had. We have better understanding of what's going on. We can make changes and improve things. The bad news is these doggone viruses continue to change, especially influenza and PRRS for us so far. PRRS is like that river. If it's roaring and it's doing damage, we're going to do our best as a team to get it back under control, understanding what we've talked about so far today. So, characterize your site. Look at it a little differently. My challenge for you to take home is think biosecurity. Now, it's going to take a long time to understand what I just said because each of your farms are a little different. If you've got animals that you're moving from this building to the breeding barn, so you've weaned these sows, you're walking them outside, you're taking them to the breeding barn, your biosecurity is so much different than if it's all under roof. You've got more control of what we call biosecurity if you put everything under one roof. So that's just a take-home message. And then use all the tools available to be able to bring that river back under control again. And I'd like to leave you with one quote. John Wooden passed away a few years ago, but he actually had an impact at Purdue University before he went to UCLA on the West Coast. Success is never final. Failure is never fatal. It takes courage. And that's what we've had to apply to PRRS over all these years. With that, I want to thank you.